Let me welcome everybody. Let me welcome you to the Future Trends Forum. I'm very glad to see and hopefully hear all of you today. My name is Brian Alexander. I'm the forum's creator, host, MC, and chief cadre. So we are here to discuss the future of education and technology. Before we begin, let me introduce to you where this comes from, how the technology works, how the session should unfold, and who provides our way to get here, and also who our guest is. So to begin with, we have a couple of slides to show you. Tara, what would you read with the first one, please? Well, while waiting for that slide to come up, let me just give you a little bit of background about the Future Trends Forum and where it comes from. So to begin with, we are one project here out of several under the header of the Future of Education Observatory. So this is a multimedia, participatory, digital project to try to grapple with the future of education and technology. There are a few other projects that are part of that, but they're overall hosted together under the header futureofeducation.us. Now, one part of that is the Future Trends in Technology and Education report. If you haven't seen it, FTTE is a monthly trends analysis that looks at trends in the present that are shaping the future of education and technology. The next report is due out next week. We have been tracking about 86 trends for quite some time now, so we have a good amount of longitudinal information. If you haven't seen it, go to ftte.us, download a few copies, and sign up. The hashtag FTTE is used on Twitter to help organize a discussion about that. Now, beyond the Future Trends in Technology Education report, beyond the Future of Education project, there are a few other things you should know. One is that this is a very, very international project, that we have as many voices as we can from around the world. So we try to include people from every continent, as many nations as we possibly can. We've had participation from all over the planet. I've presented from several continents, and we've had presenters from multiple nations. This is vital if we're going to be thinking about the future of technology and of education. We can't think about it in terms of one region or one nation. We have to think about it globally. Over the next slide, please, Tara. Before we go further, I'd like to thank some of the people who make this all possible. So to begin with, let me thank Nigel Cameron. This is a New York State nonprofit that helps get that state's colleges, universities, museums, libraries all online. We're very grateful to them for their support. We're also grateful to Shindig because, as you can tell, Shindig makes available this technology. So let me just explain a little bit. Let me walk you through how this function works. Where I am right now, and where this slide is, just for a minute, this is called the stage. Everybody here involved in this video conference can hear and see us. And this is where other people are going to be. Our guest will be here in just a minute. And if you'd like to speak with us, you can join us up here as well. I'll show you how it works in a second. Now, there are multiple ways to interact and discuss. This is not the typical webinar. Shindig supports multiple conversations, multiple venues for talking with each other. And I just want to show you a few of the major ways of doing that. Look down below the stage. You'll see dozens of people all lined up together. So right now I can see, for example, I can see Tara, I can see Todd, I can see Sharon, I can see Nate, and I can also see a bunch of individual silhouettes, like Anders Norberg, for example, or Colin Carney. Each of those represents one person or one sign-in for a group. And if you want, you can mouse over them, learn more about them. If you like to talk with them, you can double-click on them. If they feel like talking with you, their icon will swiftly move over to yours. You'll click together, and you'll have your own private audio-visual bubble. So that's one way to communicate. Now, if you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a white strip running across it. And there's several different icons there which help you talk to other people. Let me show you a few. So on the very left edge, you'll see a number with some dots over it. And that's a list of everybody who's in this video conference. Right now, I've got the number 33. So if I click on that, a film strip of everybody participating will unroll before you. So I can see Patrice, for example. I can see Paul and Mike. I can see Ben Harwood. I can see Vanessa Vale. All kinds of great people. So that's one way to get a sense of where people are. Now, next to that is a little chat box. It looks like a dialogue box for a comic strip. If you click that, up will pop a chat box for you and the 18 or so people who come into this video conference with you. So you can have quick chats with the whole group. And already our group has been introducing themselves. And we've seen people from Wisconsin, from New Jersey, from Portland, Oregon, from Berkeley, from Central Pennsylvania, and even Washington State. So that's one way to have a conversation. Another way, back down that white strip, you'll see a little circle with a question mark in it. If you click that, that'll let you ask a question or make a comment. And what we can do is we can flash that on the screen so everyone can see it, and I'll read it out loud so everyone can hear it. So that's a really popular way for communicating. Now, even better, if your microphone and camera work, click that raised hand button. That'll tell us if you want to join us on stage. It's really easy. If your camera and mic work and you're in a space where you can speak out loud, click that, we'll teleport you up here and you can have a conversation. In fact, the stage can hold up to 4 people at once, so we can basically have a panel. We'll see how that works. That's in many ways the most effective. So video, the text chat, popping up a question, these are all great ways to communicate with us. Please take advantage of these as we go, because I'm sure as Nigel speaks, you'll have more and more questions and comments. And we're very grateful to Shimmy for making this technology possible. We're also really grateful to people on Patreon. If you haven't seen it, Patreon is a crowdfunding site like Kickstarter or GoFundMe, and it's a all about funding creative people who make stuff. So they can be clothing designers, they can be game designers, they can be poets or dancers. And in this case, this goes to funding my work in the future of education. We have dozens of people there who contribute as little as $1 a month to keep the lights on and to keep all the technology humming. You can see there we have a quick list of some of the greatest contributors like Michael Higgins, Kyle Johnson, Bob Johnson, Robin DeRosa, Tom Hames, Jeannie Kim Han. Please join them. We're grateful to you for anything you can give to us. Now, on to our guest. I'm very, very excited to have Nigel Cameron here. Nigel is someone whose career I've been following because he is a very, very provocative thinker and writer. He is currently the president emeritus, and I believe the founder of the Center for Policy and Emerging Technologies, the enviable acronym of CPET. He is also currently the technology editor and columnist at Unheard, where he writes very, very thoughtful, very challenging columns about where technology is going. A particular interest of his is how technology is changing the force of automation, what automation could mean for society. So I'd like you to think about that today, how automation could change society, and then obviously what that means for education. So let me just push the slide to one side, and we welcome Nigel Cameron. Welcome, Nigel.
It's great to be here. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm glad to hear you and glad to see you. I was just thinking, if we were going to play any music to welcome you on stage, what music would you prefer?
Well, my great love is listening to the organ, and so maybe one of Louis Viern's 19th century organ symphonies. But that might not be the most popular choice.
Well, I would go with Little Toccata and Fugue. I mean, that could be.
That would do fine. A nice peppy tone to it, keep us moving.
Or a sense of dread, depending on where automation is going. Well, you'll tell us that in a little while. Let me ask, first of all, Nigel, tell us about CPET and tell us about Unheard. What have you been doing with those two organizations?
Well, if you go back a little over 10 years, I was at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago, where for several years I ran a project based on the law school. Basically, it was about emerging technologies, social impact, business impact, policy impact. And we ran conferences in Washington, D.C., as well as doing things in Chicago at IIT. And one thing we discovered in D.C., this is going back more than 10 years, was nobody wanted to have these conversations. We were looking for partners for events and so on, left, right, center, just not a lot of interest. So we thought, well, let's pick up this academic project and pop it down in Washington as a freestanding think tank and try to get Washington thinking longer term. So I spent 10 years trying to do that and failed. But I have a successor and the work continues. And, the long-term issue is the central problem in Washington. Unheard, well, this is a startup website based in the UK, where I used to live a long time ago, rolling out in the US, apparently, in the next year or so. So there are things to be done there. And basically, not a news site, comment, asking hard questions, challenging conventional wisdom. And I've been asked to lead on the technology issues for Unheard. And it's interesting. It's a startup environment. This is funded by an investor. So we're going to have to deliver, but also be serious about asking questions.
It sounds like both of these projects, CPET and Unheard, are based on the power of asking and answering difficult questions, including those based on technology.
Well, at CPET, our little motto, which we registered, so you can't have it, is asking tomorrow's questions. It astonished me nobody had got it. So 10 years ago, we grabbed that, and we've been trying to do it.
You think of me asking tomorrow's questions today? See, that's a modification, and I can have fun with that.
Our IP lawyers will argue that out.
Well, that sounds like two great projects, and I'm really grateful to hear both of them. And hopefully we can follow CPET, which has its work cut out for it, and hopefully people will be interested in Unheard and can see how that rolls out across the United States.
Thank you.
Well, based on that background, I know you've been thinking very hard about where technology is going. In particular, what happens to automation. You had a fantastic interview in The Atlantic, a very, very interesting book. Let's just start talking about that. And by the way, friends, as I interrogate poor Nigel for his thoughts about automation, my questions and especially his answers will give rise to questions and thoughts from yourselves. So please feel free to jump in using any of those different means that we mentioned before, because I don't want to dominate the floor, and you will have a lot of different thoughts. So to begin with, there seem to be a few different models for automation can end us, or where it can take us. One is that we may end up with widespread underemployment or unemployment as more and more functions are automated. Another is that we are likely not to experience that because as of the past 200 years, the Industrial Revolution, we'll just create new jobs to replace those. So we won't have truck drivers, but we may have AI massagers instead. So what do you think, looking ahead, say, 30 years? Which of those two is more likely to unfold, either the underemployment one or the creation of new jobs?
I think the debate is ultimately between those who think there will be a collapse of the notion of full employment and those who see major labor market turbulence with significantly less employment in a market that looks broadly like it does now, but in which there's a lot more part-time work, gig work, and so on. I'm not sure whether there's a serious argument to be made that things are going to carry on like they are now, even though that is the assumption being made by governments. I think it's an astonishing assumption because the evidence just isn't there.
Yeah, and that's what education tends to think. So you're seeing the choice as being less stark than the I posed, but you're seeing it's either a collapse of employment or a degradation of employment, at least in terms of numbers.
And I think we won't know. And I mean, what I argued in my book was this should be addressed as a risk question. I mean, in framing things as risk issues, it brings everyone together. You know, you've all got to plot this thing on a common little matrix, and then you begin to talk the same language rather than saying people are Luddites and all that kind of stuff, which I think doesn't get us anywhere. But the implications for education, of course, are absolutely profound. And I wrote a column recently, what I call the STEM fetish. I think the notion that the response to this situation is to turn everybody into a kind of low-level programmer technician is just about the nuttiest idea out there. Because, of course, and you look at all these lists of jobs that people like that people in Oxford and so on come up with. I mean, these are all the jobs that go to the machines first of all. The jobs that humans are going to be able to do will be distinctive jobs, and they will not basically be STEM-type jobs. They'll be STEM plus, but they will be jobs which will require the human factor, whatever that is, because that's all that's going to remain.
So doing what humans do uniquely or that we're best at, be it creativity or socialization or even some form of pattern recognition.
Well, of course, they ask questions. Wasn't it Picasso who famously said that computers are way back? Computers are no good because all they give you is answers.
They give us answers, right?
Yeah, and it's the questions which ultimately drive everything. And so far, no one has come up with a way to do anything other than with AI than program the process so that answers come out. Because the other thing which is going on, and which I think will be very significant in labor markets, is the way in which we're going to shift increasingly to capital rather than labor as a means of production. I think, again, that's inevitable at one level. How far it goes, we don't know. But of course, when you do that, you essentially grow more and more power. You put an agglomeration of power in the hands of those who control capital. And I think that's going to be going on. And part of what I go around asking is, can somebody come up with a non-socialist model of wealth and income redistribution? Because that's, I think, what we're going to have as a baseline, however dramatic the changes are.
There are some terrible ways of doing that, that's for sure. So the more capital replaces labor, we should see greater inequalities of power as well as economics. The creation of something like a Gilded Age elite that's empowered by automation.
And it's obviously beginning to happen. I mean, obviously now with these five big tech companies, now dominating the markets and doing good things and bad things, and no one has to demonize them, but they're just there. And Jeff Bezos is now the wealthiest man in the world, and he also is the world's greatest expert at user experience, consumer experience. We love using his products. But I mean, this is just the very beginning, and I think we have to do some projecting. I mean, are we going to see the world? I mean, all these sci-fi dystopian narratives which begin with the great corporation, which basically runs the world. Well, is that what's going to happen? Or are we going to discover, antitrust actually is still alive so that we can, deal with the corporate side of what's happening? But all these issues come together and they all involve a long-term perspective. And the problem with our system of government is that, God bless the founders, they designed it for a 2-year cycle. And the 2-year cycle, of course, is now what runs the United States of America.
What was that? There was a great federal office back in the 80s and 90s that Newt Gingrich killed.
The Office of Technology Assessment, the OTA. Yeah. Yes. It's interesting. There's a whole class of people in and around these discussions now who all did their apprenticeship at OTA, and they speak about it in hallowed terms as a sort of land of lost delight. But indeed, I mean, Newt, and I think he's run to seed. I think the man knows it. Well, let's not go there. But at the time, he was one of the smartest people around, and he actually grasped a lot of these issues. And why he ended up putting pay to the office that really was talking about them, well, that's one of the ironies of his rather rapid takeover and destruction of all the everything he could destroy. He destroyed it at the time, and this was a major loss.
Do you think there's anybody who's doing that kind of? Let me rephrase the question. Who is doing that kind of work the best right now outside of the federal government? Is there any particular think tank or company or heroic band that is doing that kind of work?
Well, of course, I mean, there's a lot of foresighting work going. The European Commission is good at this. OECD has done a lot of work here. I think the problem is when you start connecting to governments, national governments tend not to want to have to do this kind of thing. Of course, they hire people to do it for them at different levels, but to the extent to which they actually percolate up. I mean, just as an example of this, I wouldn't name names here, but I was in an OECD country a year or so ago, and I was talking to the top echelon of the federal labor ministry. I got all the top civil servants there for a couple of hours. A lot of fun. And one of them said to me, as someone screens and all this kind of stuff, and afterwards one of them said to me, we have never had this discussion before at the labor ministry. Now, of course, I also knew that actually wasn't true, because I also personally knew a guy further down the ladder whose job it was to do these sort of things. But at the top level, that was what was said. And you replicate that in government after government after government. I mean, I was in 10 Downing Street 2-3 years ago in London, having that invited in to have this conversation. And in fact, they had one of these people from Oxford, the original report, was also invited. Mike Osborne was invited there separately. They had a whole day, advisors talking about some of these things. And I say, well, what we need is a speech, a series of speeches, frame the questions. There has not been one major speech by a major political leader in the West on these issues until, ironically, Jeremy Corbyn, the British Labour leader, who's, of course, a far left leader, he talked about this party conference last fall in England. But I mean, I sat through every one of the presidential debates. Not a word. And of course, famously, Stephen Mnuchin, our Treasury Secretary, who nobody seems to think is a particularly smart guy, he famously said at the Axios conference a few months ago, it'll be 50 to 100 years before automation causes problems. I mean, that's an extreme example, but he's a Treasury Secretary.
Hugely influential. Friends, there's already questions beginning to pile up. Let me just remind you that if you want to join us on stage, just press the click hand button so you can pop up and ask Nigel questions. I think Nate is already about to get beamed up, so if we can have Nate Angel up here. See, again, we need a different type of music this time. Oh, Nate, can we lose you? I can hear you, but I can't see you. Are you still there?
I am.
There you go. Whoa. I can try again. Bandwidth is also an issue. Making video conferencing work.
How about now? Is that good?
Yes, and you have dramatic lighting, mate.
Yes, it is. Well, it's snowing here in Portland, Oregon, which is a rarity.
Whoa!
I was sort of intrigued by what Nigel said about coming up with an income redistribution strategy that wouldn't be socialist. And I was wondering if the issue with it being socialist was more of a branding issue in the sense that people react negatively to things being sort of named socialist, or are you imagining a completely different way of thinking about income redistribution than the kind of history of socialism?
Well, one level it's a branding issue, but I mean that of course is it's a pretty mild statement of the problem. In that we have a history in capitalist economies of a sort of duality in our politics, and pretty well Keynes famously said we're all socialists now, and of course to an extent he's right. I mean that every Western country, even the US, has heavily redistributive approaches. But we're going to have to do something, I think, significantly better than that if we see this drift from labor to capital as the means of production. And I think, if you like, it will be from the right that this thinking has to come. And it's very interesting that we've now a number of Charles Murray, for example, who's a well-known conservative public intellectual in the US. I mean, he is now talking about things like basic income and so on. I'm not an idea, but I mean, he says in a general to see that we will have the normal full employment job situation we have now. So I think in a sense, if conservatives can do this, and of course Milton Friedman was up there in the early basic income modeling as tax futures. So I mean, I think that's how it's going to have to happen. I think if it's basically a push from labor unions and from more left of center thinkers, I think this becomes another ding dong over socialism. If it is regarded as a restructuring of capitalism, which recognizes the growing place given to capital as a means of production, then it becomes, I think, a different kind of potentially consensus conversation.
I'm just curious. It's a fantastic question, Nate. I'm really glad you grabbed on that. Nigel, do you think how would one frame universal basic income as something that isn't socialist?
Well, one approach I would take to it, is to go a slightly different route and to look at this in terms of retirement age rather than UBI. I think you get pretty much to the same place at the end of the day because everyone has to have an income. I think if you use retirement age as a sort of governor in the employment system, it's a very curious thing that pretty much every Western country has been pushing up the retirement age because of what the actuaries were saying 30 years ago. And he finally got into the politics. And of course, every time you put the retirement age up, you increase the labor pool. And you make it more difficult to maintain full employment. It's a very curious thing for politicians to do, since elections are always won, or traditionally were always won, on the unemployment level. But if you go the other way, and you use employment as the governor of the number of jobs available, then I think you can make this rather attractive. We're talking about early retirement, and it also means you preserve career patterns and you get young people still preparing for careers. And whether this means you reduce the retirement age to 35 or whether you're tinkering around with it in the 50s and 60s, I think it's a modality which doesn't look like socialism at all. It just looks like a way of enabling people to enjoy their lives better, still preserving career structures.
Fascinating.
I was wondering if you would add in a concept of national service to that.
I think that's a great idea. I think that's a great idea. There are various ways you can use labor perfectly properly that don't depend upon the kind of demand which traditional industries have managed. Of course, there's a lot of naivety about this, the notion that there's some sort of economic law out there which gives us full employment. One of the things we've learned, and I think conservatives as well as more leftist economic thinkers have absorbed this, is that governments spend a huge amount of time tinkering with economies to try to keep people in work. And we've known this for a long time. This is not new. You go back to the 19th century, one of the problems with, I think, the rather naive statement was, look at the Industrial Revolution. It all turned out right in the end, didn't it? is that if you begin to look at what really happened during the first industrial revolution back in the UK, it was actually pretty disastrous what happened. Andy Haldane, who is the Bank of England chief economist, wrote a very interesting piece about this a number of years ago. And I think he said that it halved the number of skilled laborers from 40 to 20% in the economy. And it was a generation or so before it picked up again. I mean, this was catastrophic. Now, my point is, you could manage that at a time when democracy was pretty primitive and you didn't have the internet. You could not manage that sort of situation in a contemporary economy. And if we see something like that happening, that will be quite enough to cause political chaos. So I think going back and more seriously looking at what happened last time around, I think could lead to some innovative thinking, like national service opportunities, like using retirement as a governor of the system, which don't look like socialism and which give us a model in which we can actually cope with the shift from labor to capital.
Fantastic question, Lee. Great rich answer. But we have more questions.
You can throw me off the stage.
Or you can stick around for a minute, because we have Fred Bashir who wants to join us from California. Let's bring up Fred. And Fred, I'm saying you're from California. I don't know if you're still in California. I'll ask him again. Well, I hope you're there, Fred. Oh, he just popped off. All right, I have to bring him back up again. That's always the question. We'll try this one more time. This is one of the issues with making video conferencing work, is making sure that the networks can support it. Fred, can you see and hear us? I was having a hard time. Well, while Fred is working and climbing back up on stage, let me just ask a clarifying question, Nigel. So one of the possibilities you're talking about is, say, increasing the age at which someone starts working by boosting their time in some kind of national service, and then decreasing their career lifetime by reducing the retirement age to 35 or 50 or whatever. So instead of having someone working from 18 to 75, someone might work from, say, 22 to 50 or something. Is that one model of this?
Yes, I mean, of course, there's already been comment made about the fact that even though unemployment is very low in most Western economies, that the key indicator, which is the labour market participation, has been going down and down and down, because people are informally taking early retirement or becoming Mr. Mom or whatever they're doing. I mean, men who traditionally have driven this process. So we're backing into a situation which is fundamentally different, because, Keynes, in his famous essay back in 1929, 1930, talked about a new leisured class in his humorous way. And he made up a fundamental point in that essay, which was that, what does he say? Something like, nothing for the working man is so sweet as the end of the working day until the end of the working day. That is to say, people do not know what to do with their leisure. And I think it's rather disturbing. I mean, you see even, senior executives, people with culture and resources, they lose their jobs. Their lives often fall apart. We've become very bad at using time for something other than work. And so I think alongside things like national service, new kind of educational opportunities, cultural opportunities, gap years, whatever you want to do at the bottom, at the top, adjusting retirement, I think we're going to have to inject our educational system in a lifelong way with a whole fresh approach to how we use our time. So that people become able to find fruitful ways of occupying themselves and enjoying their lives and fulfilling this human thing, which isn't tied to either being at the office, being in a job, or recovering from it and preparing for it. So I think there's some really exciting possibilities here. But I think they're going to have to grasp them and think ahead, because the implications are pretty dramatic if these changes begin to happen.
So we could see a role for higher education in terms of actual lifelong learning, where someone drops out of the workforce, say at 40, goes back to school in whatever form, online, face-to-face, for a couple of years, or perhaps ends up working part-time while going to school part-time in their 30s or their 50s. So I mean, instead of having that model of the 18 to 22-year-old being where you do full-time school, we could really, truly stretch that out over one's life.
That's true, but I think one has to add that at present, I mean, notions of lifelong learning and so on, they are typically still focused on preparation for jobs. That's partly how, of course, you justify the government subventions and so on to fund your education. And I think if something of this kind begins to happen, we're going to need to recover something which is all there all along at the heart of our model, which is that, yes, they are in fact to prepare us certain skills, but they're also helping to prepare us, for other things too, which are not remunerated things. So people need to learn to read and to appreciate, to have created. I mean, a whole creation to the back of our education, out of this notion that education is there to serve the jobs market. The jobs market begins to decline. I think we have a much fresher and much more wholesome discussion of what it is we're being educated to do.
Well, this sounds like a very different purpose for education than we've been thinking about, but it's one that does go back decades and as well as centuries. We have a question from Fred. He can't come up, but we can at least flash it on the screen. So, Terry, why don't you display that question? Why is a disconnect between what futurists in Silicon Valley are saying and what economists are saying about productivity? That's a good one. Nigel, do you want to take that, or do you want to press him for clarification?
Well, I mean, I take it that the point is that economists are saying that productivity basically ought to be going up much faster if all this automation stuff is really what people is going to happen. And I mean, the part of the answer is labor market participation. I mean, there are some things out there, but part of it is that plainly we're on the cusp of something, and that it really very dramatic changes could take place very soon and very fast. I mean, just as an example, I mean, I was just writing something yesterday about Jeff Bezos and his plans for Whole Foods, which is, of course, a very, very interesting thing. He's taken over, over Whole Foods markets. And what is he going to do there? Well, the point is supermarkets operate on a very low margin, 1-2%, something like that. And places like Walmart have to have the margin because they have traditional stockholders. Bezos doesn't need to make any money because Amazon's business model, which is part of the man's genius, he's got people, investors in the company who don't mind making almost no money at all. Because they want to build market position and so on. So, I mean, but let us say Bezos decides to automate, to take over retail grocery, and he could take it over as strongly as he took over bookselling. And all of a sudden, you lose enormous numbers of jobs because of a pretty basic kind of automation, just checkout automation. And of course, his Amazon Go, which is a shop you can walk into and out of, is the model for that. So I think you could see some quite dramatic shifts, which would indeed then begin to show up in productivity and employment statistics. It's very curious to me that really smart people are prepared to sit around and say, well, there's no current evidence of a disaster, so there really won't be a disaster. I mean, risk, it's all risk planning and all thinking ahead and looking at scenarios. Now, we don't know what's going to happen, but big things are certainly going to happen. And the productivity figures, certainly at the moment, as economists will keep telling us, are not reflecting automation in the dramatic way we thought they might by now. But come back in 10 years' time. The notion that Secretary Mnuchin says it'll be 50 or 100 years, well, I think that's madness, purely in risk terms.
Yes. And productivity, what is it? I think it was Paul Krugman said it's not the only thing, it is the only thing in economics. We have Phil Long wants to come up. So let's see if we can teleport Phil to the stage. And again, as we're bringing him up, let me just remind everybody that you can see that there are several different ways that you can ask us questions and bring in comments. So please don't be shy. Phil, where are you today?
I'm in Charlottesville, Virginia.
Excellent. I hope you're warm.
Well, inside I am.
Good. You should be.
It's amazing what climate change can do with a climate-controlled environment.
Yes. Well, welcome. What's your question or your thought?
Well, I had a couple, but the first was in response to the question about the episodic, the reframing of the episodic nature of work and education. that was referred to a little bit ago. And one of the things that seems to be a significant and unspoken presumption there is that there's enough income to enable those episodic patterns to exist, because where we see them, they tend to be those who can afford to take the time off and do the other kinds of activities. And this leads to Nigel's original comment about a baseline income that supports people with the perspective of a right to have at least the ability to survive in a modern economy.
Well, I suppose my approach would be that rather than UBI, giving everybody $1,000 a month or something, I think you deal with retirement. You have national service opportunities like that, which could be much. In Germany, for example, you can do civil service. It hasn't got to be military. There are ways which you can use your time. But then, educational opportunities which are funded. And it seems to me, if people, going down to part-time labor, whatever, you say, well, here we have an opportunity. You can do a degree, you can do a higher degree, or you can study the arts in some creative way. It doesn't need to be an academic way, or you can, learn how to tinker with cars, whatever it is. And there's funding available for this. I suppose the way I start here, it may be that there will be huge amounts of new money available. We don't know that. We just don't know that. I think we have to assume that there will not be huge amounts of new money available. But governments throughout the developed world have taken responsibility, so people do essentially have some sort of subsistence funding for right through their lives. It's pretty much a baseline now. And if that's the case, how that money is distributed needs to move with the needs of this evolving situation.
Right.
And so, all I'm saying is whatever money you have, let's just say people are going to take retirement at 43 or something.
Right.
Maybe it could be conditional on their spending the next 5 years, doing some sort of research, some sort of study, some sort of, opportunity to prepare them for the remainder of their lives. And I think these are all things we need to start talking about now.
It sounds like gap year, really.
Yeah,
Gap year
it is a conversation which, at least in this country, has been relatively tone deaf to in the last few years. And it is a concern because I'm not seeing a lot of happiness around the idea that education is something that is other than another business and thus needs to be able to generate sufficient income around it to survive, or it should, in a true market, disappear. And those are the concerns that I think are predicating conversations at this point that are somewhat desperate around how these sorts of opportunities will exist when the current crop of people who are truck drivers and taxi drivers and the like are in the cusp of relatively large-scale displacement. Although recent polls from the Pew Foundation suggest that the U.S. population is uncomfortable with the concept of driverless vehicles, so it's hard to say.
Yeah, well, people. I was thinking, 10 years ago we were all scared. Well, 15 years ago we were scared of using credit cards online. People get over themselves. Part of my particular concern about truck drivers, cab drivers is these are very interesting people. They're often really very smart people who didn't do well educationally. And I think this means, as a group, they will be very difficult people to retrain. They will not all end up doing SEO or whatever it is, I think that's going to be a very particular problem. But I think more generally, human education is justified essentially as a way of getting a job or a better job, and governments put money into it because it's a way of boosting the economy. I think increasingly there will be another need there for individuals, but the reason governments will get behind it is people to be happy. I am very skeptical of all the sort of, pro-happiness stuff. Dubai now wants to be the happiest country in the world. But people need to be content. Governments are never going to get elected if there's major civil disruption. They will look for ways to occupy people. And I think this is a creative moment for those who've been on the outs in time. People focused on the liberal arts, focused on the traditional goals of education going back into classical times and so on, because this ultimately is how you frame relevance and experience and fulfillment for people. And I think governments will simply regard this as a necessity. And I think just as they will get over the fact they're going to have to fund people for early retirement and so on, I think they will get over the fact they're going to need to enable education to have these broader and more traditional goals and not justify it all in terms of preparing people, for the next hire. Because ultimately we need stability in our culture. And we have no experience. I mean, quite interesting, in Southern Europe now, they have historically high levels of unemployment, particularly among young people. I mean, it's around 50%, some of the Southern European countries. It quite interests me. If I had time, I would love to go over and do some research on this. It quite interests me that they have not had some of the sort of civil breakdown disorder you might have anticipated. Although what the longer term consequences are for young people not being in employment year after year after year on a large scale, I think that's something which we'll need to watch. But ultimately, governments are going to need to occupy people. And the sooner leaders begin to frame that discussion, I think the easier it will be for all of us.
So let me just ask one last question, and then I'll step down from the stage here.
Right.
And that is, most of the measurements of the quality and performance of our economy tend to be around metrics that actually only touch the upper 5% of the income earners in the country. So they're basically variants of stock market indices, investment indices, various other performance indices that have to do with what you typically see on the business reports in the evening, which are wildly, it seems, distanced from and disassociated with what the lived experience is with people on the ground. Have you given thought to other metrics by which those sorts of measures of engagement, productivity, social, or whatever might be developed so that there is a counterbalance to everything is great because the stock market just went up 100 points?
I think this is a very important question. And of course, it partly, it takes us into the protest politics. I mean, obviously the Trump election, the elections across Europe, both extremist elections and also in France, the election of a moderate, but basically a fundamental protest vote. Because, as you say, the metrics can be fundamentally misleading. And you go to fly over America and you find people with very different experiences. And I think, because there are two different issues here, a related question is the difficulty we have using traditional econometrics to capture what's happening even in the economy. Because, of course, now when essentially most of us have essentially free communication and knowledge access and so on all over the world all the time, how on earth do you value this? How do you put this into sort of basket so you can work out what we do with Social Security payments next year? And we have, very traditional, very old-fashioned approaches to capturing the value which is being released by these technologies. So you've got a number of fundamental uncertainties here, which we haven't mastered. But yes, you're quite right. Going back to the happiness question, I think it's a little naive, of course, partly. What was a study I saw recently that people a year after winning the lottery are less happy than people who a year ago were bereaved or lost a limb? Some absolutely extraordinary thing. That was it. I'm not making this up. Happiness is something, the pursuit of happiness is, of course, the funniest thing that the founders ever came up with, because you ultimately become happy by pursuing things that are good. There are all sorts of ways, but do you pursue happiness? Typically, you fall apart. But I think there are happiness type metrics which could be devised. And I think if they were out there in the economy, we might have had a lot more warning of the kind of dislocation that has led to serious political imbalances right across the West, whether it's the revival of the AfD in Germany, or whether it's the election of Trump. We simply haven't been tracking a lot of the relevant metrics. So I think you're absolutely right. We've got to have a bunch of new metrics there, because the stock market it's crucial, but it's given far too much prominence in our notion of national well-being.
Right. Thank you, Ralph.
Great question, Phil, and a very, very rich answer. We have more questions coming up, this time in text. Let's see what we have here, Tara. This is from Jim Holton, who asks, what impact do you see with the introduction of 5G and the ability to record tactile sensations, creating an internet of skills? Nice one, Jim.
Well, that's an interesting question. It isn't something I have thought very much about. And of course, a side question is who gets the 5G? Where is the 5G? and the greater bandwidth we have, and so on and so forth, the bigger the rural city divide and all that. The question of skills is a very interesting one. I mean, obviously, the more bandwidth we have, and the less latency and so on, then the more guru type marketplaces can operate and people can communicate and so on. But I'm not entirely sure what tactile skills you had in mind.
Well, Jim, if you want to write us a text back, or if your camera might fill up to it, we can follow up with that point. But take a minute to do that. While you're doing that, and thank you, Nigel, for wrestling with it, we had another question, I think, from Leslie Harris. Let's see what we have. I wonder, there we go. I wonder what role higher education would play in that early retirement scenario.
Well, I think absolutely huge. I mean, I have not been following the research, the project which you've been involved with here, Brian, but it seems to me a fundamental reshaping of our approach to education. And if even if retirement ages stay as they are now, because despite the fact that we're all eating all the wrong foods, we're all living longer anyway. Back when we devised these systems in mid-century, people were mostly dead in their 60s, and now very few people are dead in their 60s. Many of us are going to be around into. I saw recently a projection in the UK. Who knows how they do these things? They just draw graphs, I suppose. But half the boys born this year will be alive in 100 years' time. Now, don't ask how they get there. But that's the sort of thing we're talking about. So even if we're not pushing down retirement ages, we need things for people to do. And I think there will be increasing pressure. I think very interesting, this notion of seniors and retirees, and they've all got grey hair. And I'm 65 and I haven't got grey hair, well, not very much of it. And I've certainly got as much energy as I had 20 or 30 years ago. It seems to me that there will be increasing pressure on governments to provide the kind of fruitful opportunities, people to engage their minds, their lives, in a refreshing way. They're not focused on training to do part-time jobs. And I think we've not done that. And I think there's a huge opportunity for people in the educational world, including the for-profit educational world, not simply the public institutions, to start being seriously creative about this. And not just be putting on, cookery courses. Now, mind you, cookery courses are wonderful things, and everyone should really learn to cook. And isn't it great if you retire, you've got all the time to do that? But I mean, a whole range of opportunities, and which are cumulative, which is sequenced, so people can lead increasingly rich and fruitful lives as they get older, because an awful lot of people are going to have 25, 30 years, even in the current model, of still being around. And we simply don't have social experience of this in the past. I mean, grandparents basically ended up dying remarkably young, and that's not going to happen now.
So, in fact, we may see more and more higher education, or at least post-secondary education in general, targeting curricula for, well, I was going to say seniors, but really you're talking about retirees, which may be, Leslie's phrasing.
Well, I'd be happy if we pushed the term senior off to about 85. I think we need a sort of middling, we're sort of sophomores, in this sort of
yes. There's a
60 to 80,
In the chat box, Roxanne Riskin says 55 and better. There's a wonderful book. I don't know if you've seen this, called "This Chair Rocks." Have you seen this?
No.
It's a delightful book about trying to recover the nature of being senior from that of being senescent. It's a fantastic question. Yes, fantastic question. Friends, we have about 9 minutes to go, so I want to make sure that you get in your questions and comments before we have to end. I have several more I'd like to ask myself, but I wanted to make sure that each of you get a chance to pounce. While people are thinking about pouncing, let me just walk you back a little bit. In 2018, there seems to be a rising tide of criticism of Silicon Valley, and it's partly coming from critics and activists, people like Cathy O'Neill, for example, and it's also coming from within the House. It's coming from former executives of Facebook and Google and Apple, It's coming from investors, and it's coming from billionaires like Soros. So I'm wondering if you could, how do you, and part of that, sorry, is based on automation, fears of automation being used to dehumanize people with gasoline inequality or to violate privacy. How do you see that tidal wave of criticism splashing out? I mean, do you think we're going to have a massive antitrust movement, or do you think we'll have nationalizations, or do you think it'll just wither away and fade to dust of history?
Well, a couple comments. I mean, one is plainly, I mean, there's a sort of, we have grown up over the last 30 years with this notion of Silicon Valley, bright, shiny, fun, toy, a combination of, the John Perry Barlow with his cyberspace manifesto, internet, we're all free, sucks to you governments, which isn't exactly how it's worked. And all these little devices, these incredible things, I was just, check, what is it? An iPhone 4 had the power of the Cray supercomputer, from 1985. I mean, this is absolutely mind-boggling. And it's got to be kind of fun. We did more tax stuff and so on. Well, I mean, guess what? Now the 5 largest companies in the world are the people doing all this stuff, and they're making an absolute ton of money. And half of them are monopolies, and the rest are doing all sorts of bad stuff with their power. And it's time to grow up. And I think part of that growing up will be a powerful antitrust movement. And we'll deal with Facebook and so on as Internet. University of Chicago had a thing recently about this. And these are not conservatives. I mean, these are conservatives. These are not radicals. And they say, well, basically Facebook should be like the phone system. And you can get onto this stuff and you can move it around. And it's your data and so on. I mean, that kind of stuff is going to come to the top. And the fact that we've had these sort of penitents from the early stage of the internet. I mean, like, Sean Parker, even Sean Parker, the Sean Parker himself. What was he saying? That, God knows what this is doing to our children's brains or something. I mean, there's a maturing taking place there. And I think when people start calling Zuckerberg and the Google twins, when they start calling them tycoons, I think we're going to get a handle on the fact that this is the old JP Morgan Truff stuff to be handled. Now, parallel with that, I think we're getting more mature, personally, socially. I was just talking the other day to Tiffany Shlain, the movie maker, Webby Award founder and so on, who's writing a book now. She's talked for a long time about her family has this digital Shabbat. And she's writing a book explaining what this is really all about. Families are learning to cope with social media, cope with devices, are maturing here. It's no longer all fun. We're building this into our notions of family life, work life. And I think the Valley, well, the sheen has gone off it. Of course, the other thing to say is that, these people are making boatloads of money on what technology? On technology developed by the US taxpayer. Famously, Mariana Mazzucato's book, The Entrepreneurial State, I didn't agree with her politics, but her analysis is absolutely right. Every single thing in the iPhone that's of any interest was paid for by the US taxpayer. Apple is sitting on $1 trillion. Why is that? People are going to ask these questions, and I think the Valley is losing its sheen and will soon be put in its place.
That's going to be quite a movement to watch unfold. I had a question to follow up on that, but we have a text question from Phil Long. Phil, please fire away, or Tara, fire Phil's question. If the future involves a rethink of the structure of corporations that has some embrace of greater ad hoc formations of people working together, dynamic temporal worker networks, how would that look?
Well, it's already beginning to happen, of course, but in a fairly, rudimentary way. I mean, it interests me, for example, that, Starbucks, we all go work in Starbucks, but Starbucks doesn't have a printer, Starbucks doesn't have a little room with video screens. And I mean, it fascinates me how slow the market has been to respond to pretty basic changes. I mean, a lot of us, even people with traditional office type jobs, can work in our local communities perfectly happily 4 days a week if these sort of facilities were available. And obviously, you can take part in collaboratives of various kinds. But I mean, this is not standard issue. I think I was at an interesting conference in San Francisco last week called Work Rebooted, talking with people in HR and people in recruitment and so on. And I think there's a fundamental shift taking place in the modeling of jobs. But HR departments are among the most conservative bits of any organization. And they also tend to be left to get on with it. Rather than to be part of the innovation process, when Yahoo, which goodness gracious me, how many mistakes that company made. But what was it when the last round they called, or nobody could work from home anymore. This was one of the big things that what's her name, decided to do as she lost money, hand over fist. Marissa Mayer. I mean, just everyone got to come back in the office. I mean, this was the old economy sort of flapping its tail. I think really innovating HR, innovating the whole personnel function, innovating what a job is going to be part of this. And the gig economy has all sorts of problems, but it's a very useful experiment in how things might be reshaped. And also, just to add this, in how they might be reshaped so that basically women as well as men are catered for. And of course, our life cycles are different. Many women still want to have children. There are all kinds of things to be factored in to a situation in which the technology and the wealth which it is increasingly unleashing could enable us to have much more satisfying, fulfilling work lives, which are less of a distraction from our personal lives that are more integrated with them.
When you think back in the 1980s, people mocked Japanese society for having to define a term for death from overwork because the salarymen were dying with 70-hour work weeks. And then the United States has tried to really reinvent that and to continue to, and we're the country which has the fewest use of vacations, for example, and time off. And we're very unhappy with our work. So maybe this is one benefit if we could, as you say, have a healthier work-life balance. Friends, we have time for one more question. Nate Angel is trying to get me to relocate to Oregon. I can't do it right now. Thank you for the try. Well, I have one more question to ask, which comes back from thinking about online learning, thinking about digital learning. If as Silicon Valley matures, we'll see the technology continue to grow. People use it more and more often. It becomes easier and easier to use, and so on. Do you think that the majority of teaching and learning will shift to wholly online at some point? Or do you think we're going to continue to have this kind of two-phase, face-to-face online learning, much like we continue to have ebooks and print books at the same time?
I'm hopeful that we will see an integrative approach. It's very interesting. Until very recently, online learning was basically 19th century correspondence courses. There was very little more to it than that. And even now, it's really pretty primitive. People sit around in classrooms a bit like this, And then, of course, we have the MOOC thing, which seemed to sort of, fall on its face, but is becoming more sophisticated. I think we're going to, when you get into things like using augmented reality, virtual reality, and one of the problems is people don't learn an awful lot looking at screens, and they're not very motivated, and you can pretend they're all working with a cohort because they're all friends on Facebook. It's not been very successful. I think there are ways in which getting into AR and VR much more involving patterns, but I think also ways which tie much more with the local community. One of the great successes of the Open University in the UK has been the way in which they've had these sort of local groups in which you have a tutor who's not a great professor, but is just a bit ahead of you, and you integrate the online staff with a person. I think the real power of the digital revolution is when the digital and the analog can engage, and I hope that is the future of education.
Well, I just want to say Fred Beshears will be very happy. He's a huge partisan of Open University in the U.S., so you just made his day. And you made all of our days, because this was a tremendous series of answers to our questions, Nigel. We're at a time, and I hate to say we have to wrap this up, but we do have to wrap this up. Thank you so much for a masterclass in thinking about automation in the future. Really appreciate it.
Well, it's just been a delight. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's been a very stimulating hour.
Thank you. We'll follow up. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Stay warm. Friends, before you go, I have a couple of details about next week and some things that are coming up, so let me just quickly mention these two. So first of all, we have an unusual event. Next week, the FOCAST project is going to be doing a week-long exploration of what we can do to create some new project for the future of education and technology to succeed the Late Horizon Report. What could this look like? what would it be? Would it be a video, a PowerPoint, a blockchain? What methods would we use? Who would be involved? What would the scope be? Well, we're going to be working on that all next week, so go to my blog to learn more about that. But next Thursday, we're going to be having an hour-long discussion just on that topic. We'll be thinking about what a new project or report could look like, who would be involved. So please join us next week. We'll have some brilliant people organizing that right now. It'll be a very exciting hour. Now, also coming up over the next week, our book club is just going to be finishing its reading of Soonish. One of the authors, Kelly Withersmith, has been very enthusiastically engaged with us on Twitter and on my blog. The book is a delight. Everyone reading it is having a blast. I strongly, strongly recommend this. We'll be finishing it up next week, so please join us. Now, also coming up, and actually also on the route right now, I finally launched our bookstore. So there's one place, if you would like to shop for the books that we've discussed here on the Future Trends Forum, including with their authors, or books that we've read in our book club, it's all in one spot right now. There are 43 books, so you can go through and shop for friends, for yourself, for your library. All the authors get a royalty from that, and here at the forum we get a tiny little kickback from Amazon. It's a great, nifty little thing. Nothing like it in the world. Please take a look at it. One more thing to bring up. If you'd like to find out more about us and what we're working on, there are a few different ways. So for me, you can go follow me at Brian Alexander on Twitter or brianalexander.org for the blog. For Shindig, you can go to Shindig Events at Twitter, Official Shindig at Facebook, or Shindig on LinkedIn. So there are lots of ways to keep conversation flowing. In the meantime, let me thank you all for coming. This has been a terrific discussion. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.